This podcast is produced by Benchmark Education.
Meta-analysis. This statistical technique combines data from multiple studies about a common research question to draw a single conclusion. In this episode, English learners and the science of reading, what we know from meta-analysis. I'm Kevin Carlson, and this is Teachers Talk Shop.
We always have to consider the needs of the student. Meta-analysis is a great tool for looking at what does the average student best benefit from. But whenever you have a student coming to you who's coming from a specific context, you have to look at their context.
That is Nathaniel Hansford, Nate. He is a teacher of 11 years, the author of The Scientific Principles of Teaching and The Scientific Principles of Reading Instruction. He has taught grades K to 12 and currently teaches intermediate grades. Nate is the lead writer and content creator for pedagogynongrata.com, which bills itself as your go-to source for evidence-based education, and offers articles, books, a podcast, and other resources. Benchmark Education's Dr. Jennifer Nye sat down with Nate recently to discuss English learners and what we know from meta-analysis research and the science of reading.
So Nate, thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you are coming off of a very busy school day, so we're thrilled that you are sitting down with us to have this conversation today. So welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be on the podcast with you.
Great, thank you. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a teacher of 12 years now. I have a specialist in reading and special education. Not that I think those qualifications matter too much. I am the author of a couple books on education now. I have a new one coming out right around this time. Although I guess by the time this is aired, it'll be long out, called The Scientific Principles of Teaching, and it's really a second edition of that book.
Right.
And I also have another book published on the scientific principles of reading instruction. I'm really focused on this idea of how do we use meta-analysis to learn what is the most evidence-based strategies in teaching. I've worked in some pretty tough settings, and I'm a firm believer as teachers we should have access to the teaching strategies that are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck, for lack of a better word. And I think meta-analysis is the best tool to discover what those are. So it's sort of become a little bit of a hobby, a little bit of obsession, trying to find out what are the best teaching methods and use meta-analysis to do that. And I've also co-founded a website dedicated to that topic called Pedagogy Non Grata.
Great, great. Well, I know we're going to talk a lot today about English language learners and, evidence-based practices. Because meta-analysis is such an important, it plays such an important role in helping us to just understand what are evidence-based practices. Tell me a little bit about that. Why meta-analysis before we start talking more about English language learners and the evidence-based practices that support them?
Yeah, I think they do this poll every year that shows people's faith levels in science. And the polls have actually shown over the last several years that people's faith in science is going down. And I think part of the problem is how the media reports on science. We hear, what does the newest study show, rather than what do all the studies show? And I love to look at eggs for this, because everybody has heard someone say something to the effect of, one day they say eggs are good, the next day they say eggs are bad. How the heck do we know who to believe? I don't think science knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And this is a byproduct of the fact that sometimes scientific studies have variability due to the designs, the populations, the samples, and the results can be different study to study. So meta-analysis tries to normalize this by looking at what is the average impact across multiple studies, or hopefully all high-quality studies on that topic. And I think this is a much better way of looking at it, because sometimes you have outliers. You can have studies where you have negative outcomes and studies where you have extremely positive outcomes. It makes way more sense to take an average of all of these studies, in my opinion, than to try and find either the best study or to just pick one study where you like the outcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And because there's also contextual factors and there's that argument about generalization. So if we're talking about English language learners today, or multilingual learners, there's a lot of terms that are obviously thrown around to describe these students. Tell me a little bit about your experience with those students. What do you mean when you're using the term English learners or multilingual learners? And in what context did you work with those students?
Well, my very first year as an officially licensed teacher, I went and worked in South Korea, teaching grades 2 to 6 as an English teacher. And then 2 years after that, I moved to the far north of Canada, working with Indigenous students. And that's a very different context because a lot of those students, they learn English in their homes, but most of those parents, they're learning some combination of Korean English growing up. And there's a lot of Korean words thrown in. And there are also historical contexts like residential schools that have lowered some of the academic success rates in those communities. So it's often referred to as an ELL instruction. And I've also worked teaching in summer literacy camps, specifically for ELL students.
Okay, great, great. And it sounds like the main goal of that was to become proficient in the English language, whether
Yes.
we're talking about speaking and listening, or whether we're talking about reading and writing, or all those things combined. Is that about what you were focused
Yeah,
on?
that was definitely always my job.
Great, great. All right. So then let's kind of let's unpack that a little bit. So we know the context that these students can be in. We know what the goal is, which is of course to make sure that they have proficiency in both language and literacy. But we've also got this conversation going on right now about the science of reading, which is absolutely fabulous because it is raising to the surface some of the things that really we need to pay attention to. But within that body of research, a lot of it is primarily focused on students in that K-3 space and students who are native English speakers. That's not to say that we both know that there is a lot of research for English learners also. But here in the States, especially, we have almost 5 million students who are labeled or considered English learners. So let's kind of contextualize that with the science of reading. What does the science of reading say for those students as they're learning English, and that being the goal, literacy and language? What do we know from the science of reading?
Yeah, well, I think first off, before we even talk about like what is the science for ESL learners or ELL learners, I think we need to realize that some of the science that is for primary learners is going to connect and carry over. It's not like learning happens in a vacuum. It's the same thing when you have in my opinion, a struggling reader in grade 7 who's either had lack of schooling or they're dyslexic. They have needs that are in some cases more similar to that of a student in grade 2 or grade 3 than that of a student in grade 8, because that's where they're coming in. You know, you'd look at Dr. Linnea Erie's stages of reading development, and we have specific phases in which students acquire language. So if you have students who are still in that early language stage where they don't even have proper pronunciation of all their words, that the type of reading instruction that we're going to see in a primary class for native English speakers is going to be more similar than the type of English instruction that we would see in, say, a grade 7, 8 ELA class, at least ideally, in my opinion. You know, you mentioned how we might not have as much research, and the research is definitely focused on helping kids learn to read K-3 for native English speakers. However, by my count, there's at least 15 meta-analyses on the topic of teaching students how to read for who are learning English as a second language. And most of the outcomes seem very similar to me to what we have seen in that K-3 range and what we typically refer to as in the science of reading, because well, science of reading is a body of research and does not specifically apply to approach. People have often interpreted that to mean a type of instruction, although that's obviously a little bit of a misinterpretation.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking about, you know, you may have a 7th grade student, let's say, that's coming in that is an English learner, and that student might need, based on what you have found across these different studies, a lot of the same things that a native English speaker needs in the early grades as they're acquiring literacy. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
And I think something we should be thinking about too is just we always have to consider the needs of the student. Meta-analysis is a great tool for looking at what does the average student best benefit from. But whenever you have a student coming to you who's coming from a specific context, you have to look at their context. And I would say if you have any struggling reader, whether they're grade 7, grade 8, grade 2, learning English as a second language or a fourth language, you have to still look at those specific needs. And I think the first step is always going to be assessment. We know that most struggling readers benefit from phonics, but you might get a struggling reader who is proficient in their phonics knowledge. It doesn't need additional phonics language instruction and needs other types of instruction. So I believe strongly that the first step when you're trying to support students who are behind where we want them to be, for whatever the reason be, the first step has always got to be assessment so we can diagnose how best to help them.
After the break, motivating older students. Stay with us.
Do you need a comprehensive ELD program to help your multilingual students acquire key skills they need to succeed? Then you need to learn about Express from Benchmark Education Company. This new print and digital program for grades K to 6 delivers explicit, systematic, highly scaffolded instruction that paves the way to grade-level proficiency. Consumable student books provide access to complex, grade-level social studies, science, and literary texts. Plus, Express aligns with Benchmark Advance to boost language and knowledge acquisition with core instruction. Teach English through content with Express. Learn more at benchmarkeducation.com.
I want to revisit back to those students that are maybe older, let's say 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever the case might be, and they might be reading at a 2nd grade level, and they need those evidence-based practices to help them acquire literacy. What do you have any advice about how, though, you motivate those students? Because I know a lot of times the critique is, well, they're bored reading these decodable texts because you're trying to make sure that they're getting practice with the phonics skills that you just taught. So any advice there about what you can do as an educator to support those students?
Yeah, definitely. And this is a topic I spent probably a long time on, but
good, let's go for
it.
I think it's really a pressing one. I hear it all the time.
Yeah, well, okay, so first off, there's this idea, and this idea seems to go back to this debate between skill-based instruction and inquiry-based instruction all the time is, well, skill-based instruction is boring. And I would say only if you make it boring. And on the reverse hand, and I've been there, I was a student who was in Ontario, we have to learn French as a second language. And I always really struggled in French class. And part of why I was just really behind because I didn't pay attention very well. And then when I was trying to follow along with my classmates are reading French novels, and I don't know the French alphabet really. I know technically the letters are the same, but they make different sounds. It's very hard for you to catch up. You sort of just stare at the page and pretend you know what's going on and then write random answers and guesses. That's not fun. That's super stressful and boring at the same time. It would be the same as throwing someone into an advanced math class and saying, just play with it, have fun with it, when you don't know anything about the topic. That doesn't make any sense from an understanding of science of the instruction in general. Personally, I use a lot of games. I love to use games in my classrooms. I have ever since I was teaching in Korea, and that's a big thing in Korea. But I use games to teach the skills that are important for helping students to develop at those fundamental levels. Skill and drill works. I often hear that phrase, drill and kill, as if it's a bad thing.
That's been around a long time. Yep.
Right. And as if all rote memorization is a bad thing, but rote memorization is there because it works. And there's actually a ton of research showing that. So when we have, and that's because some students need multiple times in interacting with a piece of information to get it. You have kids who you might be able to teach them when A and E are together, A can make that A sound. you might have some kids who only need to hear that once, and you might have some kids who need to hear that 20 times who are still going to go when they see AE next to each other.
Well,
So
that
it's
repetition is so I can imagine when I'm a monolingual, unfortunately. I wish I spoke another language, but that brings in that issue of cognitive load too. So that need for, especially a language learner who is navigating their native language and trying to acquire a second language, that cognitive load is pretty intense. So giving them that repetition to really help limit that cognitive load so that they can, get it more fluently is
absolutely. And I think
valuable.
breaking those games down into those benchmark skills is really valuable and important. And it can go the other way too. I'm not going to name the name, though there was an app that I used as an adult to try and learn French. And I got really far with it, actually. The app claimed I was in the millions of words range. I don't know if it was true, but it claimed. But I started to find it very overwhelming because it taught through a whole language approach. It didn't teach any phonics, and it didn't teach any grammar or spelling rules or any morphology. And I was able to memorize a lot of French words, but it really didn't help me much with pronunciation. And it really, it didn't make me good at reading new French texts on my own. And it sort of, once I got to that higher tiers, it actually started to become incredibly frustrating because I just couldn't keep up with the work anymore without having had that explicit instruction to go along with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. You brought up bringing up the app. I'm curious is, going back to what you've learned about English learners and what they need to acquire literacy and language. And that a lot of it is the same, but also using assessment in order to make sure that you're really supporting the students' needs. So another real challenge, and I'm not sure if this is as big of a challenge in Canada, but here in the States, we don't have a lot, we have a lot of teachers who haven't been trained or not equipped to support these language learners because we have more language learners in places that they haven't historically been. So, it's good to hear that they can draw upon what they know are evidence-based practices in teaching literacy. But how can technology maybe help with this? And any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ChatGPT, by the way, is a phenomenal tool for this situation. And I was a bit nervous about the impact ChatGPT would have on education, but I've ended up using it almost every day this year as a school teacher. And I'm sold that the value for teaching, at least, I don't know about the value overall, but the value for teaching at least seems to be stronger than the possible cons, in my opinion, because you can very quickly translate instructions to students. And I think if you're going to give instructions to students and they're an EL learner, especially if they're a very new EL learner, I think having those instructions in both languages is incredibly valuable. And actually, there's a ton of research on for EL learning is feedback. In fact, I think we have more research on feedback than anything else. And for whatever reason, we have pretty strong research suggesting that written feedback is more valuable to ELL students than oral feedback. And I would imagine that that's just maybe because when English isn't your first language, your processing speed, especially orally, is much slower. And personally, I know I can read French a lot better than I can listen to French.
Yeah.
So having that written down, especially if you can have it down in multiple languages, it's great. Especially you can just translate whole text very quickly.
After the break, some final thoughts from Nate Hansford. Stay with us.
Kamusta?
Hola.
Hola.
Hello. Konnichiwa.
As the English learner population continues to grow, more and more newcomer students are attending K-12 schools.
Where are you from? I'm from Haiti.
Newcomers face a number of integration barriers as they master a new language in a different educational system. Benchmark Hello is a unique and comprehensive program that equips newcomers with essential oral language from day one.
Want to work on something together?
Yeah, that sounds fun.
Meet the unique needs of newcomers, accelerate their language development, and create an environment where newcomers thrive with Benchmark Hello.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye.
Bye.
Find out more about Hello at benchmarkeducation.com.
Do you have any of those other kind of tips that teachers can implement tomorrow to really support those English learners that are acquiring literacy and language, especially that we know is grounded in research?
Yeah, definitely. Another one on related to feedback is just there's been a lot of analysis on when we do feedback. There's sort of three different ways we can give it. We can just tell the students the right answer. We can rephrase the question to try and get them to give us the right answer, or we can explain the rule behind the question and explain why they got the answer wrong. And that last one has been shown to be the more supportive form of instruction for students. And I can also say that personally, that's a thing that I really struggled with when I tried to learn French via apps, is that once I got into the higher levels where there's multiple tenses, it got really easy to mix up those grammar rules and not have, and the app I was using would just tell you got the answer wrong and tell you the correct answer, but it wouldn't tell you why your answer was wrong and why you should have put that correct answer. So you had to sort of piece that together on your own, and it almost felt like a bit of inquiry-based learning, and not in a good way. I think similarly, there's some research suggesting that segmenting drills are specifically valuable for ELL learners. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And in particular, it's supposed to help not only with spelling and comprehension and writing and listening, but also pronunciation. Because when you do a segmenting drill, not only are you teaching how a word breaks down, not only are you teaching how our spelling system works, but you're also teaching students individual phonemes in the English language. And I know that that's a thing that ELL students are going to struggle with. I know from personal experience, I still struggle with all the sounds that exist in the French language. So providing that explicit instruction on what are these individual sounds and how do words break apart with them is really valuable.
Good, good. So all of these, I know that you are passionate about digging into the meta-analysis to find out what works. What recommendations do you have for teachers who maybe are not doing that right now, but really want to know what works? How do they cut through all of this noise, and what advice do you have for them to really get to what works and without needing to dig into necessarily heavy research or meta-analysis and, you know, all of those different types of things? What can they do to figure that out?
I mean, there's lots of little things they can do. There's lots of meta-analyses in education that are open access that they can view, or at least the results are available. So if they are interested about a particular topic, let's say a teacher trainer comes in and they say, we're going to start this new thing. Everybody's going to be doing collaborative inquiry. It's the best thing that has ever been invented for teaching. It's going to solve all your problems. You can just go into Google, you can type collaborative inquiry meta-analysis and see what the researchers found. And the value of a meta-analysis is that it's going to look at multiple studies at once. If you want to look a little deeper, there's a great website out there called Hattie Meta X, and it keeps a summary of basically all education meta-analyses that have ever been written on all topics. It's an incredibly valuable website. It doesn't give a lot of context, so it'll just tell you the results, the name of the study, and the demographics. There's my website, which is free, is teachingbyscience.com or pedagogynongrata.com. We had so many articles, we had to make a second website.
Good problem to have, right?
Yeah. We have a lot of articles on a lot of different topics, all focused on, well, what does meta-analysis show on this topic? And lastly, if you would like to spend your money, you can always check out my book, The Scientific Principles of Teaching. It's not only does it provide a summary of a large number of meta-analyses on education, it also has several chapters devoted just to explaining this topic a little bit more and how to understand meta-analysis as an everyday teacher.
Great. Those are great recommendations and great resources. So I appreciate you sharing those. And something you said very first is, if a trainer comes in or you're doing professional learning, and Google it, but you also said question it. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of new teachers, or maybe even experienced teachers, I knew it took me a long time in my career to feel comfortable that I should question it versus just assume that, oh, this is an expert telling me this, then this might be right. But I think that we've obviously all learn, that that's not always the case. So being confident to question the practice and dig a little bit deeper to say, is this truly something that is going to move the needle for my English learners and really all of my students?
Yeah, I just think in general that expert model doesn't really work in the sense that there's just millions of people out there claiming they're an expert in education, and they don't all agree with each other. And then you're sort of stuck just picking, well, who's my favorite? I think it's a better way of looking at it is who's presenting the most compelling evidence. Don't worry about if you like them or if you like what they say. Worry about what kind of evidence are they presenting, and sort of the credibility that way.
Yeah, and I think that is wonderful final advice. I've learned a ton in our conversation and just really appreciate you questioning and digging deeper and helping educators all around the world.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast. I enjoyed our chat today.
Great. Thank you so much, Nate. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Nate Hansford. Thank you, Jen Nye, and thank you for listening to Teachers Talk Shop. In this episode, you heard Nate and Jen discuss meta-analysis of English learners, along with some techniques to help those learners that you can bring into your classroom right away. To implement these evidence-based techniques, you need high-quality instructional materials. Benchmark Education can help you put research into practice with materials designed for English learners at any level of language proficiency. Benchmark offers programs that engage minds, elevate achievement, and empower every learner. Visit benchmarkeducation.com today to get started. For Benchmark Education, I'm Kevin Carlson.